What's up guys, the Strong Boys 19 here. So this is going to be another video for the Tiermaker album ranking segment. So since I have done the Tiermaker discography album ranking with the previous band, which was Deftones, I just thought I would like to do a few more, or maybe a lot more, in the Tiermaker website. And before I start, I apologize for the way I sound. I've been going through a bit of a heavy cold, and my voice sounded hoarse and just, really rough. But I actually did make a community section post if I was going to do a Gojira album ranking, and some of you guys agreed that I should do that. But since that I have been thinking about ranking Fear Factory's discography, I just thought I would like to rank their studio albums from the first to the latest. So this is going to be on my personal opinion, and I know that you can change the letters from the grades into a word, or how you would rank these albums from the top to the bottom. But this is going to be my personal opinion, as always, for many album ranking lists that many people do. So if you want to rank Fear Factory's discography in the comments down below, please feel free to do so. Alright, so let's jump right into it. So the first album, Soul of a New Machine. And I'm going to put this album in B. Now, this is the first ever release that was entirely written and being put out for the first time in Fear Factory's discography, their very first output. However, this was not actually their very first album. There was another album in their discography entitled Concrete, which was actually the first album that they've done, but they've scrapped it because they were not happy with the result, and Ross Robinson was involved with the band at that point. Come to think of it, I don't see Concrete in this list, which I should have checked, but who cares? But anyway, Soul of a New Machine is, to me, a really, really good debut album. It's their heaviest record. I can see the influences from bands like Godflesh to Napalm Death, and Burton's vocals on this album sounded at his rawest, and I do like his lower tone when he goes into these death metal growls, and I think some of the instrumentation was really, really good. This is their most aggressive sound with the massive tonality and the production. But for a debut album, I think that this is really, really good. Does contain some of my favorite tracks on the record, and some Fear Factory fans would put this in as maybe a classic or as one of the very best albums. But this album is in my top 5 Fear Factory albums in their discography. Excuse me. So anyways, that is Soul of a New Machine, Fear Factory's official, but not really very first debut album, into the B tier. Now we're going to go into one of the essential albums in the industrial metal genre. Excuse me. And that is Demanufacture. And I'm going to put this album in S. So a lot of fans would pick Demanufacture as the best Fear Factory album, and I can see why. There's just a big wall of sound, a newer, better, fresh air kind of production with this album. It sounds absolutely spectacular. This is the first of their consistency of concept albums of Man vs. Machine, heavily inspired by 2 films, being The Terminator and Blade Runner. And Demanufacture is just all around a classic album. Some of my Fear Factory favourite songs of all time have been tracks like Demanufacture, Self-Bias Resistor, Replica, to New Breed, and this is a very consistent record as well. Even though that Dark Day Sunrise was a cover, that takes away the main concept and arrangement from the rest of this album. But I think that cover really suits that kind of sound with the other tracks earlier and later on with the record. Production is just as completely polished, and Dino Cazares did all of the bass work on this album, even though that Christian Oldwalbers was credited and included on the album's booklet, but Christian joined Fear Factory pretty much close of completion from the album's release, although he did do a bass on 2 separate tracks to the record. Vocally, Burton C. Bell's vocals were just spectacular, and Raymond Herrera's tectonic and machine-like drumming, the aesthetic, heavy sound on this album was just incredibly great. I do love this album. From start to finish, this is one of the essential albums into the industrial metal genre, as I've said. So, yeah, Demanufacture, No Rhyme or Reason, is one of the classics in Fear Factory's discography. Next album is Obsolete, and I'm going to have to put this in S as well. This album, the more I play it, the more I think about it, this is another concept album following up the experience with the similarity on Demanufacture's concept. This follows the main protagonist being the Edge Crusher, and you get to be introduced to various characters like the police Securitron system and the other great aspects of this album. From start to finish, this is their masterpiece to me, and I know that Demanufacture has been praised as the best Fear Factory album, but there's something about Obsolete that really marks it for me as maybe my new favourite Fear Factory album. I love every track on this. You got tracks like Shock to Edge Crusher, Resurrection, which is one of the very first tracks I've heard from Fear Factory in terms of the actual material on a Fear Factory album. Descent, which is another one that I adore. I love the remix version that was included on the Demolition Racer, and that was included on the Hate Files compilation. But anyways, Obsolete, just like Demanufacture, is a very, very awesome, consistent album. This contains some of Burton C. Bell's very best vocals. He adds a lot of soul and passion into his music, and Dino's riffs were just so diverse and very catchy. I love other tracks, Smasher/Devourer, and the wonderful closing track, the pretty emotional one of Timelessness, and the rest of the album is just one of the best albums that Fear Factory had ever released, in my opinion. Maybe my absolute favourite Fear Factory album, the more I think about it. Production, just as phenomenal and as awesome, like Demanufacture, and this just follows Demanufacture's vein so well, and I am very curious to know which Fear Factory album is your favourite with your ranking. Some say Obsolete, some say Demanufacture, but for my pick, this is my favourite Fear Factory album. The more I think about it, the more I talk about it. So yeah, Obsolete by Fear Factory on the S tier. Now we're going to go into an album that I always loved, and it was my favourite Fear Factory album. I know it got very controversial over time for a lot of people. Some people don't like the record, but I can respect the opinion, and I was very surprised that from the video of the making of the album, some of the guys had cited this as their favourite Fear Factory album. The last album with Dino Cazares before he left the band, and that is Digimortal. Now, it would be so obvious for me to put this in the S tier, but I am going to put this in A. Now, this was a record that I was loving very much. Tracks like What Will Become, To No One, the absolute classic single of Linchpin, to Byte Block, Memory Imprints, Never End, and I love the raw demo version of Never End, differently titled Will This Never End, again included on the Demolition Racer PlayStation 1 game. But I find a weakness point on the record. I think the track Back the Fuck Up is very much cheesy and the weakest number on the record, so that kind of spoils the adrenaline that I had with this album. But this is something more simplified, and this is more onto the vein on, I guess, the new metal sound. It's not as technical and more very simply driven, and still works as an effective Fear Factory album. But for a lot of people, they cite this as a massive disappointment to follow up Obsolete. But I just admire Digimortal with its separate identity. Not to mention that the Digipack version of this album does contain some bonus tracks that sounded awesome in my opinion. And Full Metal Contact, again included on the Demolition Racer PS1 game, as I've said that a few times now. I love that very great, groovy, catchy instrumental. Production is pretty much similar to Obsolete. It still has the dynamics, and for this one to be Dino's last Fear Factory album before he eventually came back to the band, I think this is a very, very well done album. And I still stand by my opinion that this is an underrated classic album, and I'm interested to see what your words are for Digimortal in the comments. But anyways, Digimortal on the A tier, to me, is a very acceptable position. Now we're into the next album, Archetype, and I'm going to put this in A as well. This was an album that I was playing very consistently, and this was the first album to include Christian Oldwalbers taking over the lead and rhythm guitar department, because Dino was out of Fear Factory, out of action with the band. But Archetype is a mad grower for me. I mean, I really liked the album when I had bought it and played it, but I think that this is another underrated album. I love more of the tracks as the band go into this. Slave Labor is a masterpiece of a song. The Fuck You to the Music Industry track of Cyber Waste and the title track Archetype really brings some nostalgia for me. And I love the melodic vibes that Burton's vocals really came into this album. And Bite the Hand That Bleeds made me think about the music video, which was included in the first Saw film. But I think that the technicality has returned on most of the tracks. There are some tracks that I really like that much, that it does contain some of the best underrated Fear Factory tracks, like with Digimortal. But I love this album. The more I got into this, it was just one of those albums that some fans do regard as maybe a masterpiece or another amazing album. But in my words and in my books, Fear Factory's Archetype, following up Digimortal, is a really great and a strong, brilliant follow-up to Digimortal. Now we're going to go into the next album, which is Transgression. And unfortunately, I'm going to put this album in the C tier. The album that to me is very rushed, and Christian did not like the making of this album. The production and the mixing is the weakest part about this record, in my opinion. It's not as well balanced, and it's just not a very well put together album, if that makes sense, to follow up Archetype, because Archetype was very strong, but I think Transgression is maybe their weakest and lacking of consistency album. But don't get me wrong, there are some heavier tracks to the record, and some of Burton's vocals sounded brilliant on this album. The first half was pretty good, but the second half of the album really falls flat for me, especially with their U2 cover, which to me is just one of the most boring covers that I've ever heard. And some of the later tracks are not really memorable and just lackluster. It was just not a well diverse and consistent record to follow up a very different but brilliant album like Archetype. So I think Transgression, with my opinion, is really not a great album. It's more of a mixed bag, or just a below average album. And the more I thought about the record, I just don't think it has aged very, very well. And that is maybe the worst part about this album. And I can see that some people say that it's a good record, or some people regard it as the worst of the worst in Fear Factory's discography. But that's personally all I would like to say for Transgression. Just a really difficult album for me to include their discography, as that Fear Factory's discography is one of my all-time favorites. Well, yeah, Transgression, the bottom of the list for me in terms of my order for Fear Factory's discography. Okay, so we're going to go into the return with Dino Cazares, returning back to the band, and the next album, Mechanix. I'm going to put Mechanix in the B tier. So Mechanix did credit Byron Stroud from Strapping Young Lad, and as well as Gene Hoglan, the only Fear Factory album to include him on the drums. But I personally think Mechanix is not one of their very strongest albums. It is always a massive improvement over Transgression. However, I don't regard Mechanix, in my opinion, as like a very strong album. But don't get me wrong, I think that some of the tracks here sound very, very good, and it has a separate form of arrangements that I think sounded really good. But I personally regard that the earlier Fear Factory albums, including Soul of a New Machine, to connect with me, and that the earlier era of Fear Factory is where that the favoritism really means a lot to me. Mechanix does have some very, very good performances and great, monstrous, aesthetic riffs and instrumentation. And also, this is the first to not include Raymond Herrera. As I've mentioned, Gene Hoglan just now. So he was out of the band. And I personally think that the weakest part of the album is the sound of the drums. I just don't think that the drum sound on this album is all that special. And with Raymond Herrera and his action on the drums, the production on earlier Fear Factory albums, they were just a unique sound. And I think that's what's missing with the drum sound on this album. But the rest of the production sounded very good, and I think that Mechanix follows the similar vein of aggression, like on the early heavy sounds from Fear Factory's music. You hear some more of the lower tuned, distorting guitars, and some of these really, really good performances from Dino's groovy and thrashy sounding riffs. And I think Gene did very, very well for the drums. But again, like onto Demanufacture and other Fear Factory albums, Dino did the bass work with this album. And even though that Byron eventually became the band's touring bassist, he did get credited for this album, but it was Dino, once again, that did the bass for this album. So anyways, Mechanized by Fear Factory is, to me, a really good album, but I don't really regard it as highly as many fans do, for the most part. Right, so we're going to go into the Industrialist, and to follow up Mechanize, I just don't think that this is as weak as some fans say that it is. And to me, it's a better album than Transgression. So again, I'm going to put this in B. Now, with this album, I think that this is maybe one of their very underrated albums. This is the first to credit Mike Heller. However, this is the only Fear Factory album that it was entirely drum programmed. And I don't dislike the album for that, and I respect the idea, but most of the album entirely was written and recorded by both Dino and Burton. So the only two members from Fear Factory did all the work for this album. I think that this album does contain really, really good tracks. Virus of Faith and some of the earlier tracks and later tracks. There are some weaknesses that kind of falls flat for me. There are some tracks that don't really follow for me. God Eater being one of them. To me, that's maybe the weakest number on the record. But I think The Industrialist is a very solid album from this band. Well, for Dino and Burton, I should really say. But I did give this album a replay ability, and I think that this album is just, to me, really solid. A very solid album, but I can see why some people would disregard this as just, not one of the best. But I give it a lot of respect and the credit, as with the continuation goes with Fear Factory's career. I think that the newest sound of Fear Factory, to me, sounded really good. But I'm always the big fan of the era from the late 90s to the close to mid-2000s era from this band. But yeah, The Industrialist, I think it sits well into the B tier. Now, with Genexis, I know some people will say that it's a better album than The Industrialist, but I don't really think that it works out as well as the earlier albums or like The Industrialist, in my opinion. But again, I will have to put this in B. I know that most of the Fear Factory albums in my list are in B, but I think Genexis is a bit of a weaker album to me, in my opinion at least. There are still some moments that some tracks kind of fall flat a little bit, but I think just like with Mechanize, the album does have some brilliance, and I just don't really think that it was just like a great Fear Factory album, but with that album being in the B tier, I think it just perfectly fits in alongside with the others in that same tier than the album of Transgression. I find that Genexis sometimes lacks in a bit of a memorable sense. There's barely enough hooks on some of the tracks, but I do find that some of the other ones sounded really, really good. Some more onto the lower, genty, aggressive sound that Dino decides to do a lot onto this newer direction for Fear Factory. So this is another album that does credit Mike Heller on the drums, and I think it works out really well. And I do think that Mike Heller definitely deserves a lot of the credit, as well as Raymond Herrera, who I still defend and prefer over Mike Heller, but there's no denying or disrespect whatsoever with Heller, with his ability. But yeah, Genexis as an album, I think it's very solid, like with The Industrialist and Mechanix, but I just don't think it is one of those albums that stands out as greatly as the earlier ones. So now we're going to go into Aggression Continuum, their final album with Burton C. Bell. As I did review the album, as Burton did record his vocals few years before he left the band, and Dino went through previous lawsuits with former band members involving Christian Oldwalbers and Raymond Herrera, and I still think that this is one of my favorite albums of the year. I'm not going to go over crazy where I will put this, but I'll just have to put this in B. I still think that this is Fear Factory's best album since Archetype, and I would have put this album in A, but for the sake that my list in Tiermaker is totally different to how I would rank this band's discography from the bottom to the number one spot, I think that B is very acceptable. And I find that the material on here has been really, really good. There's a lot more versatility, and I think that there's a lot more of the melody and really good progressive sounds. And I know that some people do find the orchestration bits a little bit distracting, and some of the choruses to be weak on later tracks, but they never really bothered me that much. But I think what works more than the choruses is just the vibe that it reminds me of early Fear Factory sounds, and the aggressive ability on this album to me defines Fear Factory a bit better than some of the previous recent albums from their discography. Burton's vocals sounded really good, though I wish that he could have done more of the dramatic performances when he goes into the higher vocal ranges, just like what he did with albums like Archetype to Obsolete. And I think that Heller's drumming on this album works so efficiently. A brilliant member and addition for this album. And Dino, with his work on this album, so dedicated, and I think that it does contain some of my new favorite Fear Factory tracks. Really great stuff onto this record, and I have done an album review on this album for those that have not seen it yet. So personally, I think Aggression Continuum is an album that I pick over Genexis, Mechanix, and The Industrialist, but I think my top 5 would be Soul of a New Machine, Archetype, Digimortal, Demanufacture, and Obsolete. Those are my 5 favourite Fear Factory albums, but I think Aggression Continuum as an album is really good, and just a brilliant album in their discography. So that is it, guys. That is my Tiermaker album discography ranking for Fear Factory's albums, and let me know what your ranking is into this style of ranking the albums in the comments down below. Always a massive fan of Fear Factory, one of my favourite bands of all time, and just because that my list will be different to yours does not mean that there should not be any judgmentalism, in my opinion, because we're all open, and if your list is different to mine, then be my guest. You can have whatever ranking that you want for a band's discography, just like what I did with mine. Anyways, guys, I'm going to be doing the Gojira album ranking very soon, hopefully in the next few days or week on Tiermaker. And once again, I'm very glad that some of you guys really appreciated this style of album rankings, and I'm going to be doing more on that, but I will still stand by my more favourable pick on ranking the albums in the numbers part of ranking albums. So anyway, that's that. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, I will keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.